Hi, my name is Aris Fioretos, and this is Stockholm in early May 2020. I'd like to tell the story of my voice. But first, what is that? A voice. Unless they are mute, writers too obviously have one. Yet, do we write in our voice? After all, a language is not the property of one sole being. Languages are shared. By definition, they require more than one person to be comprehensible. Not even writers, who tend to be careful in the use of language, not even they can decide wholly or even mainly what a particular word might mean, often not even how it goes about signifying once it has been put on paper. So what does it mean to acquire a voice as a writer, one's so-called own voice? That supposedly inalienable way in which we may try not only to tell others who we are, but also attempt to demonstrate that this voice alone should be recognized as ours, even if we speak in the third person singular or let fictional creatures have their say. I'm not certain I know, but I would like to tell the story of my voice, or rather, an experience I associate with it which has proved pivotal to my sense of writing. Being the child of an Austrian mother and a Greek father, born and raised in a third country, Sweden, for as long as I can remember, voices have been fraught with tension. I had difficulties ignoring the cadences of my father's Greek in his Swedish speech patterns, or the rolling, German-sounding R's when my mother spoke. Already at an early age, then, I felt the presence of one language within another, as if there were shadows cast whenever my parents spoke that did not belong to the particular Swedish words that they used. I remember thinking that the dark outline flung by träd, for example, didn't resemble that of a tree, but rather that of an orange or a campfire. The shadows were specters from foreign tongues, oddly displaced, deracinated even, yet silently reminding me that there existed other territories of speech where they would make a perfect fit with something like a tree. Their dusky silhouettes divulged the presence of a sphere within my parents' brand of Swedish, which nevertheless remained foreign to the language proper. My father had fled his native country shortly after the end of the Civil War, in the early 1950s. By way of Switzerland, he arrived in Vienna where he met my mother. A few years later, he went to Sweden to make some money over the summer, contracted tuberculosis, and was hospitalized for close to a year. When he was released, my mother joined him in what would eventually become the home country of the future family. Because he had fled Greece, my father could not return until after the fall of the dictatorship in 1974, a quarter of a century after his departure. As a child then, I didn't become properly familiar with this country, with its lived culture and language, until I was well into my teens. At home, we first spoke German, the language in which my parents had originally gotten to know one another. Increasingly, with each new child, we turned to Swedish. When I was 18, having gotten so caught up in words and the alphabetical marvels they seemed to promise, that I thought I may have something to convey that had yet to be said in world literature, I spent the summer in Greece. It would be the first time I was on my own for any longer period of time. I considered German my mother, or rather my mother's tongue. Swedish was my native tongue, but what was Greek? Because my family had spent so little time in my father's country, I could manage my way on the football field, at the taverna, and at the ocean, but serious discussions that required clarity of thought and lexical precision eluded me. It seemed to me that the difficulties I had finding my voice as a writer somehow related to this faulty Greek of mine. As soon as I had visited my relatives in Athens, I set off to the southern part of the Peloponnese, to that middle tongue of the peninsula which is called Mani, the most underdeveloped region of the country at the time, where vendettas were carried out well into the 20th century and life displayed certain similarities with mafia-run societies. The region might even be called the Sicily of Greece if it were not for the fact that Sicily really ought to be called the Mani of Italy. This was a region from which my father's family originally hailed, or rather from where his bigamist grandfather had eloped with another woman 2 generations earlier. Fearful of a vendetta, they had settled 3 days' donkey's ride further north, not far from Olympia. When my father grew up, there was only one person left from the original branch of the family tree. This uncle ran a coffee house in a quiet harbor town. He was married to a woman 10 years or so his junior, spent most of his time at his Café Neon, where he played board games and collected the latest gossip, while his wife tended to their little house overlooking the harbor. They had no children, but would welcome having me stay for the summer. I found my bearings in what was called the saloni, the room where my uncle used to take care of his business correspondence. There was a bed, hard as concrete, 3 or 4 elegant chairs, and a table in front of the balcony. Every day during that summer, I would sit down at my transportable Swedish typewriter, an old Halda my father had acquired when he first arrived in Sweden. He still kept its twin with Greek keys to himself. The table was rickety, which didn't bother me much, but my uncle's wife ran a tight ship. Each chair in the room was covered in plastic so as to spare the cloth from dust and other catastrophes. You could set your watch to when she potted her plants, rearranging the chairs in the process, and the little oil lamp that she lit in front of the icon and the photos of her relatives was only ever to be extinguished at nightfall. Every morning, having opened the doors to the balcony and the sea spreading out immensely beyond the rooftops, I began work by removing the humiliating white crochet tablecloth that the lady of the house put underneath my typewriter. It sufficed that I visited the loo for a few minutes or went to fetch new cigarettes for it to be back in place. To my volatile 18-year-old mind, that tablecloth began as a nuisance, transformed into an indignity, and finally became my arch enemy. As long as it stayed in place, snugly slipped underneath my typewriter, I felt unable to string even 2 cogent sentences together. Quite clearly, the saloni was not big enough for the 2 of us. During the 4th week of 8, well along the path towards despair, if not lunacy, as I had not been able to get more than a few pages written, all of them wretched, I finally realized what I must do. I would never win this tug of war. Was it not better to give in, to let my aunt have the final say in matters pertaining to workplace fashion, and leave the tablecloth where it was? After all, if I squinted, I might pretend it was a miniature version of a flying carpet. And what did literature do other than taking you to places you would not be able to visit on your own? After that, and despite my faulty Greek, I sailed along. None of what I wrote that first summer in life as an author merits any mention today, but the tablecloth that supported, or better, carried me and my words made me discover that however many shadows are cast by and in literature, it all begins with a white surface. You must make friends with it, even if it is a humiliating crochet tablecloth and all you have is a broken tongue. Has the voice I began to chase that summer in the late 1970s become properly mine? I don't know. You tell me.